Hi, everyone. I'm Mike Griffin. I am a principal in the Seattle office of Jackson Lewis. I'm here today with my good friend and colleague, Michael Thomas, in our Orange County office. And we're going to be talking with you briefly about stress and anxiety in the workplace. Basically, why this is important to us, why we're passionate about it is because it's something we all deal with on a daily basis. And we really want to try to help continue the conversation, raise awareness so that maybe in a small way, alleviate some of the stigma that might come along with experiencing stress and anxiety in the workplace. Michael, what would you say about that?
Yeah, so thank you for listening, and I always enjoy spending time with my colleague Mike Griffin. And I'll just kind of highlight really briefly, why stress and anxiety, is kind of important to me. And part of it is just wanting to show up authentically with myself in the workplace and not feel anxious about whether I belong or whether I'm being judged for any given reason. And so part of that is just checking on my own well-being. Like, how am I experiencing stress? How am I experiencing anxiety? And how am I showing up authentically? And so, one of the things that, we want to talk really briefly about just to kick this conversation off is, why should employers kind of really, care about this issue? Why is this a concern for employers? And we'll talk about this topic in greater detail, but there's increased demands in the workplace. There's a lot that's going on outside of the workplace and also inside the workplace that creates more stress and anxiety for your employees. And so employers are seeing really a sharp increase in, burnout and stress-related accommodation requests. And also many employers are having some challenges struggling with how do you actually navigate or respond to these types of different requests. And so understanding your legal obligations, implementing proactive strategies, and even fostering a culture, and I'll talk about this briefly, called psychological safety, are really key components to creating a healthy workplace, mitigating litigation risk, and mitigating some costly issues or risks that could come up in the workplace. But I'll turn it back to you, Mike, just to really kind of kick us off by really kind of defining what is stress and anxiety that we're talking about.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, I mean, if you think about it in its most basic sense, stress is what arises in us when something we care about is at stake, right? So emotional, physical, mental strain that in this context can be associated with work expectations or experience. We care about work, right? And our reputation as an employee, as a manager, as whatever role we have is at stake. And so stress and anxiety can arise in response to those workplace demands, especially when they feel overwhelming. And so, of course, if you think about short-term stress, this is normal, necessary, everyday stress we experience, time to get up on time, to get a project done on time, to make sure I get to work on time, things like that, right? To accomplish goals. That's normal. That's okay and not necessarily unhealthy. When stress or anxiety becomes unhealthy, it's when it's chronic, right? When it's something that doesn't go away. We don't get relief from those feelings. And the ways in which it can manifest itself, this is not news to anyone, I'm sure, but increased heart rate, physical clenching of the jaw or tightening of the shoulders. I don't know about folks who are listening, but I know that at times when I'm stressed out, I find myself really tightening my shoulders or hunching them over, and I catch myself and try and relax a little bit. Upset stomach, poor sleep, being short-tempered, right? Which of course can have some other workplace implications, poor posture, and ultimately a weakened immune system, right? So there's a lot of ways in which this stress and anxiety can manifest itself in negative ways at work. And I'm wondering, Michael, if you can talk a little bit about just how to identify the sources of our stress and anxiety.
Yeah, no, and thanks for kind of highlighting all the different symptoms, because I think we all kind of experience stress and anxiety at different points throughout our day, but we don't necessarily label it that way. But when you say, yeah, like my breath becomes short, I get that, or my heart increases in different moments, like things like that, you can identify. And so like your sources of stress and anxiety typically are going to fall into two different buckets. Like one is the stuff that does occur within the workplace, and there's other stuff that occurs outside of the workplace that makes its way into the workplace. And I'll mention what I mean by that in a second. So the stuff that occurs in the workplace is things like stuff that Mike mentioned, like long hours, like heavy workload, even changes within the organization can create a certain amount of stress and anxiety, or change in work duties, or lack of job security, so economic insecurity that many people might be feeling right now. Other things that we see in our line of work that create stress and anxiety are things like harassment and discrimination in the workplace, or even just poor management employee relationships that often involve a union coming in, things like that. All those different things can create stress and anxiety that occurs within the workplace. But then there's everything that's outside the workplace that makes its way into the workplace, right? And that's things like bombardment of news can create stress and anxiety. This feeling that the workplace in our nation is more polarized creates stress and anxiety. More information about violence either around the world, violence within schools, violence within the workplace, having more exposure to that kind of stuff creates more stress and anxiety. So even just as an employer, when your employees are showing up, they're showing up with all of that stuff. A simple example is, kids have recently returned to school. And you have a lot of parents that have heard a lot about and some have experienced school violence, and they're worried about their kids. Like they probably are checking their phones throughout the day. Again, like these are things that are outside the workplace that actually make their way in the workplace that involve stress and anxiety. And so, Michael, I'll kick it back to you to maybe talk a bit about what are some legal obligations that an employer should think about, and what are some risks they should think about in terms of managing stress and anxiety?
Yeah, there's quite a few. I'll talk generally about them. You think about it this way: increased stress and anxiety among workers in the workplace can lead to increased requests for accommodation for mental health support. I practice in this area quite a bit and provide a lot of advice and counsel and training. And I've seen an increase in this probably every single year for the past decade in the number of requests employers are getting for accommodations based on stress-related conditions. Now, those conditions, of course, may qualify as disabilities under both the federal law, ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the equivalent state law. And so obligations kick in right away to engage in a good faith interactive process. Whether the employee, typically it's when the employee requests an accommodation of some sort or time off. But in some states, like my state in Washington, the obligation for an employer to engage in that process, to initiate that process, is a bit heightened. And so, as is probably not news to folks, failing to provide reasonable accommodations can lead to things like internal or external complaints from employees who have made such a request, or a mishandled request, right? Legal action, not only EEOC charges, but lawsuits. And outside those legal risks, you have, some reputational risks. This can damage the brand. It's not surprising that folks feel more emboldened these days to talk on social media and review websites about their experience at work. So failing to identify these and address these risks can increase those concerns as well. So a lot of concerns arise in this area, whether employers are addressing stress and anxiety related conditions appropriately. And so, Michael, can you talk about what some best practices are to deal with this?
Yeah, that's a great question, Mike. And so really proactively addressing stress accommodations, it's, as Mike pointed out, it's not just about compliance, although complying with the law is incredibly important. It's really about building that sustainable and supportive workplace, or sustainable and supportive workplace culture. So there's 5 tips that I'll kind of go through to help you do that. The first is really kind of recognizing that stress is a legitimate workplace challenge, and understanding that chronic stress is a valid reason for an accommodation request, and should be taken seriously whenever an employee actually makes it, and it should be treated as a disability accommodation that I think we're all familiar with. The second tip that I would say is, really you want to implement a clear and compassionate process for mental health accommodations. So proactively train your managers to be able to identify and handle stress-related accommodation requests appropriately. As Mike pointed out, sometimes it's difficult for someone to actually be able to identify that a stress-related accommodation, might be needed. But as an employer, you have that obligation to engage in an interactive process, right? So properly training your managers and being very clear and concise and compassionate about those processes and policies for mental health and stress-related accommodations becomes incredibly important. Number three, there's other reasonable accommodation, stress and burnout accommodations that you should consider. And so some of those examples could be flexible work schedules, like adjusted work hours, possibly hybrid or remote options if that's available for industry, modified workloads, depending on, again, what your industry is. So reducing non-essential tasks, things like that, reassigning responsibilities, mental health breaks. So one way that you can use PTO, or having employee wellness days, like that's one way of kind of providing a reasonable accommodation. Making sure that employees have awareness and access to your employee assistant programs. You're making sure that you actually have employee assistant programs becomes really important as well. But realizing that there's a variety of different things that you can do that actually is a reasonable accommodation request. That's a reasonable accommodation for these requests for stress and anxiety accommodations. Number four is creating that culture of psychological safety. And I mentioned that a little bit earlier. And that's really creating an environment that encourages conversations about stress and burnout without someone feeling like they're going to be retaliated against for really asking for help. So creating that culture where you reduce the stigma of having conversations about stress and anxiety and burnout, or even mental health in some ways. And then I think the last thing that I would point out is, be really proactive if you're working in a high stress related work environment. For example, like a law firm where we work long hours, we have a lot of stress, kind of implementing these tools, reducing that stigma becomes really important to be proactive about it versus, waiting for someone to ask for help. Because sometimes by the time someone asks for help, some of that harm or that damage that Mike talked about, like your increased blood pressure, all those different kinds of things, has already kind of occurred, right? And so I think those 5 tips in terms of how the employer as an organization can respond to these increased requests for stress and anxiety accommodations and so forth, I think that's good for the organizational perspective. Mike, I want to turn it back to you because we're not just talking about the organization, and how they respond to stress and anxiety. How do individuals, as they show up to the organization, how do individuals manage their own personal stress and anxiety and sense of wellness?
It's such an important question, Michael, and something that is, what I'm going to talk about are some techniques for managing coping with stress and anxiety that are not going to be groundbreaking, shocking to anyone, I don't think, but it's helpful to just be reminded of some effective coping mechanisms, because there are plenty of coping mechanisms that are unhealthy and ineffective. Before I talk about these, I just want to briefly jump back to what I was talking about earlier in the legal risks. And I didn't want to give the impression that, that employees have a legal right to a stress-free workplace. That issue has been litigated and come up quite a bit. No one's really entitled to that under the law. What's more common, what I see, is stress-related conditions like generalized anxiety disorder or depression, things like that clearly do qualify as disabilities. In terms of techniques for coping and managing stress, one key to keep in mind is avoidance doesn't work. So avoidance, basically. How do we avoid, and how do people avoid their stress and anxieties? They mask it. They cover it oftentimes with substance or other addictive behaviors that don't really help. They, generally speaking, the research shows, exacerbate the issues. Quality sleep is I can't overstate how important that is, based on just my limited amount of research on this and very personal. It's incredibly important. More and more research shows that sleep is probably the single most important healthy activity we can engage in. Of course, regular aerobic exercise is a tremendous benefit. It seems like every other week there's a new study reminding us of why it is. But also in that vein, relaxation techniques like yoga and meditation, breath work. There is an enormous amount of resources online for free that can teach you very basic meditation and breath work techniques that are very helpful. And I use them this week, as a matter of fact, when I had a difficult day. Limiting our exposure to social media and news, probably also not very shocking to everyone. That can tend to cause us stress and anxiety. Really important to take breaks during the day. One thing that has worked for me on a personal level is if I've had a stressful situation is just walking out of my office, going outside and walking around the block and coming back up. So simply getting your body moving in some positive way can really help cope. Obviously, eating healthy, limiting substances that affect our sleep and our well-being generally. So, limiting alcohol and other substances. And last thing I want to mention is something I learned from a book I'm going to recommend after I finish this little discussion here, which is focusing on your resources. So your family, your friends, your work resources, rather than the challenge that you're facing right now. Whatever that stimulus is that's causing you stress, you're going to necessarily devote some mental energy to that. But if you can, in the same experience, focus on how am I going to resolve this and what resources do I have to resolve it? Studies have shown that really does help alleviate the anxiety. And the last point I'll make on this coping techniques topic is that you are not alone. You have resources, you have family, you have friends, you have colleagues who care about you, and tapping into those resources can be a tremendously helpful benefit. Before I turn it over to Michael to take us home, I just want to make a couple of quick recommendations, reading suggestions or listening suggestions if you do ebooks. The Upside of Stress by Kelly McGonigal is a fascinating book on research. She highlights essentially explaining how generally speaking, how we think about stress can determine whether or not we develop chronic anxiety stress or whether we use it in a more positive way. Really interesting book. Two others I would recommend, a book called Breath by James Nestor and a book called Why We Sleep by Matthew Walker, a researcher at, I believe, Berkeley. It changed my whole perspective on sleep and just how important it is and regret it, caused me to regret some earlier years of my life when I thought sleep wasn't that important. So thanks for listening. Michael, I'll turn it over to you to take us home if you can.
Yeah, no, thanks, Mike. Always a pleasure spending time with you, man. A lot of what we're talking about is like part of the employer's kind of basic obligations, create a safe work environment, for the employees. And I think in our modern culture, we hear more about stress and anxiety. We experience more stress and anxiety, and that likely is going to continue going into the future. And so really supporting your employees that are either facing burnout, stress, increased anxiety, in some ways is no longer really optional. It really is an essential part of creating that both an inclusive and legally compliant, work environment. So employers really should, commit yourselves to proactively addressing these types of accommodation requests and implementing practices that really create a sustainable workplace and fosters a culture where really all your employees feel like they do belong and really can thrive. And so I think that's all that we have for this podcast. So Mike, always a pleasure. Great having conversation with you. I got some reading homework from you, so I partially appreciate that. Maybe that makes me a little bit more stressed. But we also want to thank you all for taking time out of your busy day and your busy life and sharing a little bit of your time with us. And so thank you, and stay tuned for more information from our firm.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to Jackson Lewis's podcast, We Get Work. As a reminder, this material is provided for informational purposes only. It is not intended to constitute legal advice, nor does it create a client-lawyer relationship between Jackson Lewis and any recipient. We Get Work is available on Apple Podcasts, Libsyn, and YouTube. For more information on our topics, presenters, and other Jackson Lewis resources, visit jacksonlewis.com.